So let's go ahead and get started. Dave Carlson from UW-Whitewater at Rock County has worked on that campus in Janesville since 1993. He loves the place so much, he works 3 jobs there. He's an academic advisor. He is the coordinator of the Learning Support Center, which means he's in charge of tutoring. And as a philosopher by training, he has taught such courses as ethics, logic, philosophy of religion, technology and values. And with David McKay, our lecturer from last week, who's also in the audience today, he teaches a course on the history, science, and ethics of the atomic bomb. That course is actually team taught by 3 gentlemen named Dave. If you want a lecture on the fascinating scientific discoveries that led to the atomic bomb, it's Dave Murray you want. He won't be with us this semester, but this Dave and his wife have 2 grown sons who no longer bring laundry home with them, but do delight their parents by coming over for dinner and even inviting them to go golfing and biking and backpacking together. Please welcome Dave Carlson.
Can you hear me? All right. Last night, my wife and I were even invited over to have dinner with our son. He fixed dinner for us. Maybe you were all fortunate enough at one point to have the tables turned that way. Yeah. What did they have? Oh, it was delicious. He and his girlfriend made fajitas. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was ice cream for dessert. So I ate more than I should have. But enough about my family, or almost enough about my family. I want to also tell you a bit about my father. About this time, 75 years ago, he was milking cows, but the draft board called. And in August of 1945, he was in the Philippines. He was a communications staff sergeant, and we're talking today about events that might have led his life to turn out very differently, might have resulted in there not being a me here to talk to you. And I think it's actually rather difficult to say precisely how that fact that I'm here and that maybe each one of you is here for the complex reason that the way history turned out, Harry Truman did drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, explains why we're here. I'll come back to that nagging thought in my conclusion. And I think because the camera is focused on the podium, I should come back over here. So if I come over there, you can shoo me away and have me come back here. We're going to talk about the moral judgments that we have made, that those before us have made about Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. There's great historical interest in why Truman decided as he did, and I think many of you enjoyed Professor McKay's lecture last week, which was rich with historical detail. But we can take an interest, whatever age we are, in the arguments for and against Truman's decision, not just because of historical reasons, but for the possible guidance that our reflection on that momentous occasion can provide for decisions that we, directly or indirectly, that we or our leaders make today. But it is not our purpose, it's certainly not my purpose, to make a moral judgment about Harry Truman. My goals here this afternoon are to demonstrate how some aspects of moral theory can shed light on just exactly why dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki has continued to generate such interest. Life is full of tough choices, even tragic choices, and our decisions made in the heat of the moment may or may not be what we wish they were, but in hindsight, perhaps we can learn more clearly why others disagree with us, as well as how in the future we might wish our leaders to act on our behalf. You might not change your mind, but I hope that you will have some interesting thoughts as you leave here about why you think as you do about the dropping of the bombs and why others might disagree with you. I'm first going to draw a couple of very general distinctions that are important in almost every discussion of controversial moral issues. And then I'm going to elaborate some of the finer points of what is known as the just war theory, and talk about how the application of that theory to the circumstances of 1945 might still today be, well, enlightening, but still very difficult. So bear with me. I assure you there will not be a quiz at the end. I said that I don't want to change anyone's mind, and I don't think any of us here would want to be in the position of making a judgment about the character of those who make tough decisions, not like Harry Truman did in 1945. So let's draw a distinction between the deed and the doer, between the decision and the decider. In life, we recognize that good, decent people can make errors, can do wrong, and conversely, those whose character we don't truly or completely admire can sometimes surprise us and do the right thing. When we look at contemporary events, I think that the shoe is on the other foot, and we may form opinions about the likability, the character of our leaders, and be very quick to judge the feasibility, the wisdom of any proposal they make based on what we think of them. That's a mistake. But it's equally a mistake, and I hope that I will avoid it, equally a mistake to come to a conclusion about whether dropping the bombs was the right thing to do, and concluding from that that either Harry Truman was a great man or that he was a wicked man. I don't pretend to know the soul of Harry Truman. But we can look at the facts, and we can consider the application of the just war theory and other moral principles to the case without feeling that we are taking sides on a more personal matter. But one of the things that is often said about Harry Truman in his defense is that he faced a tough decision. No doubt about it. Maybe it might be said he was in a dilemma. And the second distinction I want to make, besides that of the distinction between judging actions and judging the character of those who do those actions, is a distinction between different types of dilemmas. A dilemma, maybe simply understood, is a tough spot, being caught between a rock and a hard place, being damned if you do and damned if you don't. And in late July 1945, it sure seemed to many, it may have even seemed to Harry Truman himself, that he was exactly in that kind of a circumstance. That the choice, though Professor McKay outlined a great number of possibilities, that the choice seemed most starkly between launching a major land invasion of the Japanese homeland or using this new weapon, the atomic bomb. I'm going to suggest that the situation, even if at that time the two best options open to Truman were to invade or to drop the bombs on a target in Japan, that even if those were the best choices then, there's still more that we should consider. And it has to do with the nature of moral dilemmas in general. Suppose that I've gotten myself in a little bit of a pickle and I've borrowed some money. And I promise those to whom I owe money that I will pay them back as soon as I can. But somewhat foolishly, I promise one friend that I'll pay him back next week, and under the pressure of circumstances or not wanting to be embarrassed, for some reason, I promise my other good friend that I'll pay him back next weekend. And my paycheck won't cover both debts. We know that I ought to keep my promises, but if I've made two promises that I can't keep, I could keep one, but then I'd break the other. Or I could keep the other, but I'd break the one. I do face a dilemma, don't I? But to talk about slightly different moral circumstances, you know the line from Shakespeare about the tangled webs we weave. If I have, even if through no fault of my own, if I have gotten myself into the circumstance where I have incompatible obligations and I cannot help but do wrong in one way or the other, the fault doesn't lie with the standards of morality. The fault lies in me or in some neutral set of circumstances that maybe no one could prevent. But we must draw a distinction between, well, what the old philosophers in Latin called perplexity simpliciter and perplexity secundum quid. No one's taking notes on that Latin. You could impress your friends if you remembered that Latin phrase. Sometimes we're perplexed. We don't know what to do, and it is simply because, through no fault of our own, we don't know what to do. Moral theorists have traditionally held that no true moral dilemma arises like that. No moral perplexity is ever simple perplexity. Morality always gives us, given what it is a system of thought designed to provide guidance. Morality always points the way to one or more choices of action that are justified. Doing the right thing may not be easy. It might not even be easy to figure out what it is. If I've borrowed money, I may have to forego the pleasure of, shall I say, buying myself some ice cream when I owe the money in my pocket to a friend. I would sure like to keep it for myself, but in a mild way, that's a tough choice I have to make. I enjoyed what I spent the money on sometime in the past. Now I promised that I would pay it back. If I've got the money, I pay it back. There's no real moral conflict there. If there's conflict, it's between my desires and my duty. But sometimes, if we have begun to weave that tangled web, then yes, maybe there can be at the surface a conflict of two duties. My duty to pay back one friend and my duty to pay back the other. But the fault lies in me for having made a foolish promise. I'm no better off than the young man who first promised one girl he'd marry her and turned around and promised the same thing to another girl. But, yeah, maybe that's a more serious problem, even if we're talking lots of dollars that I would owe in debt. In situations when we have gotten ourselves into a pickle, this is when a familiar principle comes into play. You've all talked and maybe been counseled to do the lesser of two evils. I've said, and I'll repeat, that moral theory tells us that if we never make the initial misstep, if we never begin to mislead or make false promises, we won't ever have to do anything evil. But if we have once sinned, if we have once made promises it was wrong to make, then if I'm now having to choose whether to marry you or marry you, the principle of the lesser evil doesn't seem like the right word, but if I owe money to two, I may have to decide who to pay back based on who needs the money most. It is in exactly circumstances like this, when we have, through our own fault, created a secondary kind of moral perplexity, that we can find guidance, and this is the only time when we can find guidance in the principle of doing the lesser evil. And in fact, if you consider maybe what you would regard as admirable about people you know, perhaps it sometimes involves what they have done when they've made mistakes and they need to make it right. That if I had promised two people all of the excess from my paycheck next week to cover my debts, and I decided that, well, since I cannot pay off both of those debts, I might as well go spend the money on myself again. Because I would not be doing the lesser evil. So, you might be thinking about how this applies to the case of 1945. Perhaps there are aspects of that circumstance in July of 1945 that made it look like there was an inevitable choice to be made. Many have thought that in hindsight, of course, there might have been other options open to Truman. David McKay has talked about some of them, but I want to look at them again through the filter of the just war theory. And maybe one of the conclusions that you will come to is that, indeed, Harry Truman did face a kind of dilemma, but again, in a way that does not reflect on his character, but just on the choices that one would have had to make. Maybe we will think that some prior choices made differently would have avoided the dilemma. So those are the two distinctions that I think it is worth keeping in mind, that we are talking about an action, a decision, and not the person who did those things, and that though at the time a tough choice might have been made, perhaps behind that choice or prior to that choice, there was a way that the nature of the dilemma involved might have been avoided. All right, on to the just war theory. The just war theory is not a reference to war and only war, just war, but it implies a distinction between just and unjust wars. It is sometimes noted that World War II was the good war, a good war, fought for a just cause. That is the first element of the just war theory, that war is a means of solving problems, of addressing acts of aggression that have already been committed or are about to be committed by another nation. War is not justified as an excuse for territorial enlargement or for aggrandizement. War is morally justified when, and only when, a wrong has been done and a nation sets out to restore the status quo. That's the main principle of the just war theory, that there be a just cause. And we have seen in recent decades military actions undertaken for the reason, as outlined in our president's declaration, that there is a just cause. In fact, that was the name of an operation. But I forget which operation it was. That was called recently, I'm talking in the last decade or two, Operation Just Cause. I don't see anyone recalling what it was. The point isn't important here in talking about 1945. Instead, let's look at a few more specifics of this theory, the just war theory. War ought to be a last resort. If we have not made effort to negotiate, if we have not offered the offending nation a chance to make right, then we are pursuing a course of action that is unjustified. If there are other ways of bringing about the status quo without the loss of life and property that war involves, we ought to pursue them. War should be a last resort. But as well, war ought to be proportional to the wrong that it seeks to right. A slight territorial invasion, if such a thing could be described as slight, but maybe the taking over of a port or an oil field when no loss of life is involved. Certainly stands in contrast to a deadly invasion of a peaceful city. You can pick or come up with an example that suits yourself, but certainly there are times when, as in interpersonal matters, our response might be out of proportion to the wrong that has been done to us. If you insult me or give me a casual disregard, I should not react by slugging you. And the same thing holds in interactions. I mean, it gets a lot more complicated, but in relations between nations, the military response to wrongs ought to be proportional. And there ought to be a reasonable, the third element of just war theory, no, this would be four. Just cause, last resort, proportionality. Fourth, there ought to be a reasonable chance of success. Those who have counted the cost and take a nation to war ought to know that it is not a futile cause. Fifth, I just have six, so bear with me. Number 5, non-combatant immunity. This point came up frequently last week, and it is with good reason. If there is a nation that has done wrong, that has been an aggressor against us or against a third party, the wrong that has been done by that nation's army in particular, that nation's leaders who put their armed forces up to no good. And it is in stopping their further aggression that we are entitled to use even deadly force. But if there are uninvolved citizens in that country that has done wrong, our restoring the status quo does not require us to make any change in the lives of those who are not involved. Now, to what extent there are any citizens who are uninvolved in the wars of their nation is a debatable matter. But if there are true non-combatants, the principles of the just war say that war ought not to be fought over them or on them. And the final condition of a just war is that there be a fair settlement. If war is justified as a response to aggression, and the purpose of war is to make that aggression go away, to make things right, if we or any other nation claim that our aggressor ought to surrender unconditionally, we are, or that nation making the claim, is claiming the right to do more than just make things right, but to grab a little extra more territory, to inflict punishment that is not proportionate to the wrong that has been done. So it is significant that although the Potsdam Declaration did include the phrase, I'll just read the line to you, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces," it is, I think, significant and laudatory that in the rest of the Potsdam Declaration, what plainly count as conditions of surrender are offered. Harry Truman, along with, would it have been Chiang Kai-shek, President of the Republic of China, and Churchill, assured the Japanese people in the Potsdam Declaration that the Japanese military forces, after being disarmed, shall be permitted to return to their homes. Japan shall be permitted to maintain such industries as will sustain her economy. other conditions are offered. So the Japanese could know that in surrendering, we were committing to abiding by those conditions. But there is one condition not stated that is more often than any other thought to be key to there being a dilemma facing Harry Truman. And that is that the status of the Emperor of Japan is not explicitly addressed in the Potsdam Declaration. And that's what I want to talk about in the remainder of what I have to say about the just war theory. And we have maybe 10 minutes tops, and then we'll have time for questions, and I'd like to hear what you think. But although the Potsdam Declaration leaves open the possibility that the Emperor of Japan would be allowed to remain emperor, and in fact, isn't that exactly what happened? The emperor was forced to renounce his divinity, but as you all know, the emperor continued to play a vital role in Japanese society, not just through occupation, but to this day. And yet, what the Potsdam Declaration says regarding Japan's emperor might, in the view of some experts, have been enough to explain why the Japanese kept fighting against all odds. The Potsdam Declaration said that Japan must decide whether she will continue to be controlled by self-willed militaristic advisors, and said there must be eliminated for all time the authority and influence of those who have deceived and misled the people of Japan. And the United States in the Potsdam Declaration insisted that a new order would be established in Japan. Irresponsible militarism must be driven from Japan. And again, the phrase repeated, a new order established. That there be a peacefully inclined and responsible government. Suppose, then, that this could be read by the Japanese as leaving us the option to depose the emperor, whether the Japanese people were willing to do that or not. The question arises, is retaining the emperor, is deposing the emperor necessary for setting the status quo back in place, for undoing, for remedying the aggression that Japan had committed against so many nations? In the case of Nazi Germany, it's pretty easy to see that there could be no peace made with the Nazis. That the removal of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was a condition to Germany being able to rejoin the democratic, the peaceful world of international politics. But as history bore out, Japan, with an emperor, is able to rejoin the League of Nations. And if Harry Truman, if his advisors, if the United States had made the acceptability of the emperor more clear in the Potsdam Declaration, then and I think this is perhaps not just the main, but the most powerful argument to consider, then perhaps Harry Truman would not have found himself facing that dilemma to either invade or to use the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We don't know what the Japanese would have said had there been clearer terms, because we didn't state those terms. But the argument has been made that any nation in our position at that time would have owed the people of Japan a better faith effort at negotiation. Now, in response, it might be said, offers like in the Potsdam Declaration had been known to the Japanese all along. They could have surrendered anytime. And here's where maybe the potential newness of the atomic bomb matters. Perhaps what leads us to wonder whether we would have chosen differently, whether we would have wanted, or we would now want our leaders to do things any differently, comes to this, that before we drop a weapon of such terrifying, immense, quick, destructive power as the atomic bomb, we ought to go back to the table one more time and offer those clear terms for surrender. Would it have made a difference? That may not be the point of the critics. Because if at that point, being told more about both a terrifying weapon that would be about to be unleashed, and on the other being assured the status of the emperor, had Japan still refused to surrender, okay, then much the same choice would have faced Harry Truman. But it would no longer have been the choice between two wrong actions. The responsibility for the death of not just Allied forces, but the responsibility for the death of all the non-combatants who would have died in an invasion of Japan, and the responsibility for the death of non-combatants in Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have more clearly been upon those who turned down the stronger and arguably more just terms of surrender. That, as I've said, is, I think, the most compelling argument for thinking that even if Harry Truman did on August 6th the least evil thing that he could have then, he still deserves, or no, not he, but that action deserves judgment as having been a choice made that could have been avoided. I have other points to recall from various lectures in a class, but I know you don't want a quiz and you don't want me to keep you from dinner. So I'm curious to hear what you think of some of these points. Thank you.
Okay, I'll bring the microphone around. Did I see a hand over here? Right here? And anybody else? Did you have a question? Okay.
At what point did Harry Truman learn of the availability of the atomic bomb in his decision-making process?
David might be able to give you an exact day and hour, but here's the gist of it. although he had been on a very powerful Senate committee overseeing spending for the war, he was kept in the dark. He became president on FDR's death before he knew of the Manhattan Project. And I just think this is mind-boggling. So he was informed of it. No, he knew of the existence, but he didn't learn that the Manhattan Project had been successful and that a bomb could be deployed until he was at Potsdam in July. When did he become president? April. So he'd only known about the Manhattan Project and our attempt to build a bomb for a couple of months. Our president only knew then.
Other questions? Yeah.
I have two thoughts. Were there any of Roosevelt's associates that were familiar with the bomb? And the second thing, it's not necessarily with the bomb, but we have not had a legal war since the Second World War, because Congress is supposed to declare war, are they not? And what are the ethics of the current and fighting since that time?
Well, of which there's been a lot. So if we wanted to open up that can of worms, we could talk here for a long time. Let me answer your first historical question first, or rather, let me ask Dr. McKay. I can think of the fellow from South Carolina, Jimmy Burns, right?
Jimmy Burns, yes. The new Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, who knew about it. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of War. Any number of Roosevelt's staff, maybe not many, maybe half a dozen. But there was a very small number of people on Roosevelt's staff who continued into the Truman administration. And I believe it was Cordell Hull who took Truman aside and said, I got something I need to tell you.
And Jimmy Burns, having been brought up in South Carolina politics, was one of the hardest playing members of Roosevelt's cabinet, and he was among the most dogged in arguing for the use of this new weapon.
Henry Stimson, I'm sorry. Henry Stimson.
Henry Stimson
Yeah,
was
Henry
the Secretary
Stimson,
of Defense.
Of War.
Oh, even more, okay. I will defer on historical matters to my colleague. But you raised an interesting question about what turns out to be crucial to our thinking about the morality of war. Another element of the traditional just war theory is that any war that is morally justified must be declared by a legitimate authority. You and I have limits on how we can use force. By living in a civil society, we give up the right to use force just on the grounds that we might like to, or that it would be to our advantage to be able to beat someone up or take their money. We give that over to the police. And when we live in a, call it this or not, a League of Nations, it is, in the rare exception of morally justified revolution. It's a question that came up on this continent, it's coming up in Venezuela today. Except for that case of revolution, which experts think can be discussed even under this paradigm, that the authority of the current regime is lost. We speak this way, they've lost their authority. Now, it's not quite that dramatic in the case of presidential acts that are then, extra legislative, that don't have the backing of Congress, but it is worth debating that perhaps from our own standards, we are violating the standard of going to war when we do not follow our own rules for what constitutes our military actions being declared by a legitimate authority. In our case, that's Congress.
Okay, who's next? You got all the questions out last week? Okay, we'll go here and then here.
You said that there was, we should have given them a clearer or more distinct choices, and this would have changed that whole dilemma if we had given them more choices or clearer choices. I don't think we owed them that. I think we gave them the choices and they didn't react. So I don't agree with what you're saying, that we owed them another chance at these choices.
Yeah, I think that is a plausible response. I added, as I think many have wanted to add as a special point of emphasis, that if we owed the aggressor another warning, it may have been on account of the newness of the weapon that we were about to unleash. But I mean, experts and pundits and lay people, commanders and soldiers alike, have disagreed about whether we owe them that. And I'm glad you made the point that way, rather than relying on just the claim that they wouldn't have bought if we had made different terms, it would have made no difference. My colleague pointed out last week that another thing that might have been done differently, dropping a test bomb so as to demonstrate the power of this new weapon, was rejected by Truman's advisors for the reasons that it might not have worked, it might not have been convincing. Those points could be granted, just like it could be granted that the chances that Japan would have accepted the offer of surrender on clearer terms regarding the emperor, that's not what's crucial, because if we had taken the time, as it were, to drop a demonstration of the bomb, that would not have ruled out the possibility that, being unconvinced by that, we then, if the Japanese were unconvinced by that, we just bring the next bomb when it's ready and drop it on the target that we would have dropped it on the first time. It is as though we want to put, and I think any nation that is committed to minimizing the harms of war, puts it on the aggressor to take responsibility for the deaths and the destruction involved in war. So that even if the Japanese hadn't accepted the different terms, even if the Japanese had not been convinced by a demonstration, we could say that we tried. And you are absolutely right. We had tried other steps. We had all along made it clear what we were seeking. But given the newness of the bomb, did we owe the Japanese people, did we owe the world some additional step, is the question.
Maybe you've already answered this, but had anybody in America or anywhere any idea of how much damage was going to be done by the atom bomb before we dropped it? For example, the bomb the Nagasaki bomb didn't do anywhere near the damage that the Hiroshima bomb did. We did know somewhat about Plan B, that is the invasion. We had been island hopping and found it very costly.
Yeah. You asked what we knew about even the potential devastation that would be wrecked by an atomic bomb. No, we didn't know as much as we know now. And last week we talked about the wildly different estimates that there were about what the cost would be in American and in Japanese lives of the invasion. But I'll go back to what I would say is the relevance of doing all that one can to avoid the use of a bomb that kills non-combatants. The Japanese emperor, the Japanese military establishment would be even more responsible for the deaths of civilians who might have been called up to action in defense of the homeland in an invasion. And this comes off sounding not quite right, but we should have given the Japanese a chance to make it their own fault at every step of the way. I wanted to include this personal note that, my dad said when I was growing up that bombing Hiroshima was a terrible thing. He was stationed in Yokohama during the occupation, and he said he would have been there a lot earlier and might not have come home. All he did was go to Japan so that those who had really done the fighting could come home. And he used a theological concept to kind of sum up his thoughts about the bomb. More Latin for you. Maybe you've heard the phrase felix culpa. We should never do the wrong thing just because it's easier. Do the wrong thing so that some good could come of it. We should always do the right thing. But the nature of the tragic world we live in is that, as I said earlier, I'm here. Maybe you're here. Our lives are as they are in part because wrong has been done. It doesn't make things that were done any less wrong. But we don't need to catalog the wrongs that humans have done throughout history. But maybe by discussing the nature of the principles we would apply to choices, I'll hold out the vain hope that we'll make fewer mistakes. We'll do less wrong in the future.
We're talking about this from an American point of view. What about current Japanese scholars or scholars from other countries? What are their attitudes towards our dropping the bomb?
I have not studied that, and I can defer to David if he's done reading on that. But I want to insert one comment. Harry Truman, to his credit, did not take into account just what the cost would be on American lives, what the loss would be on the Allied side, but in contemplating what at the time he thought were his only choices, that dilemma, perplexity secundum quid, that dilemma that he faced would have involved terrific loss of life for Japanese. And it was as much that concern. So I know you meant like what have Japanese historians, scholars, and folks thought, but it's not as though Americans or Allied discounted the lives of the Japanese when they made that decision to drop the bomb. Yeah. So let me, again, I'm lucky I have my historian colleague here with me. I just sit around and think about the philosophy of it, you know.
As a general rule, American scholars tend to be fairly split on whether the bombings were the right choice or not. And they tend to support it more of them to fall on the side of dropping the bombs than not. Japanese scholars tend to be on the other side. But you'll find that regardless of the origin of the scholar, you're looking at the same data, you're looking at the same events, you're looking at the same moral theories, you're looking at the same stuff. And you do find a lot of division among scholars all over the world. And as far as consensus, there really isn't much. There are schools of thought. There are scholars who will tell you that this was the right choice, that this was the best thing that could be done. There are scholars who will say, no, it wasn't, and you will find those scholars among all nationalities from where they come. As I said, on the part of the Americans, we sort of lean toward the yes, the Japanese lean toward the no for fairly obvious reasons. But as far as world scholarship is concerned on balance, I don't think there is a particular consensus.
Was any consideration given to the originators of the science that were sending letters to the top brass that they shouldn't make or continue or to let loose the bomb? And the consequences to our society today are pretty disastrous.
You refer, I take it, to the scientists and others in the Manhattan Project who conveyed their opinions up the chain. As to the extent to which they were heard, again, the historian can comment. What would I do if he wasn't here? I mean, I'm in a position to tell you whether I think they should have on some abstract principle of who should be whose opinion should be heard, but whose opinion was heard, there's the fact of the matter.
The fact of the matter is that what you're talking about is called the Frank Report, F-R-A-N-C-K, and some word of that did reach up to the decision makers, but by and large, this was not considered a decision that the scientists had any real role in. Their job was to provide the weapon and let the strategists figure it out. So as far as Truman and his advisors were concerned, they did not particularly worry about it. That comes out much more after the war in terms of policy debates about that.
Yes, and after the war, but within 10 years, the lead scientist of the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer, had been stripped of his security clearance. Which makes little sense. So I don't know. I think it suggests something about how prophets are without honor in their hometown.
You know, on that note, we're out of time for Q&A in this forum, but both Daves are here, and so I'm sure they would answer any more questions that you have. The 2 hours for these lectures went by very quickly, and I think we would all love to take their class, right? So thank you all for joining us today, and join me in thanking David McKay. Thank you all.
Thank you, David, for being here.